All right. Well, hello, econ students. Miss you guys. Um, these are some videos to review our readings for this week after Easter vacation, April 20th and on. We got 4 readings related to our topic of labor. These will be the last assignments before we go into a review of chapters 8 and 9, business and labor. But I'm just going to make a video for each of the readings because I know sometimes they can be a little dense. But again, hopefully from these videos you can get some of the power, the impact. Again, I really think there's some powerful lessons that from these econ topics that will be applicable throughout your lives, not just assigning it to keep you busy. So anyway, let's just jump right in. We'll go over chapter 10 in this video, chapter 10, job discrimination. And so we'll just go through the 4 questions, and then of course you can find the quotes yourself. Okay, so here we go. First question. Um, what are 2 ways to define job discrimination? Which one is more prevalent in a free market? And so he uses this idea that when you hear the word job discrimination, what does that mean? Because the word discrimination, um, there is a good form of discrimination. You know, to have to be somebody of discriminating tastes just means you make choices based on certain standards. And so it really depends on what are you making your discriminations on. You know, I always say, I'm very discriminating when it comes to not eating dog poop. I discriminate against that because that's gross. It's going to kill me. It's going to make me sick. And so, yes, I will not do that. And so that is a good, I would say, discrimination. While if I say, well, I just don't like people because of the color of their skin or because whether they're male or female, that might be an arbitrary, unjust form of discrimination. And so he applies that here to job discriminations in the same way that there is a bad way of discrimination. So the first way to define job discrimination is you take individuals from different groups and you hold them to different standards. So like I will not. This is what most people think of when they think of this. Oh, just turning the heater off, making a lot of noise there. They think of, well, that we're not going to hire blacks, or in the early 18th century, we're not going to hire any Irish. I'm sorry, early 19th century, we're not going to hire any Irish, or we're not going to hire women, or I'm not going to hire you because of whatever reason, some arbitrary different standard. You might have the same qualifications. You might even have more qualifications than the next person, but because of something irrelevant to your ability to perform the job, I'm not going to hire you. And so that's again discrimination based on holding groups to different standards. Um, and so that's one way of discrimination. The other form of discrimination that, again, I would equate to more of a good type of discrimination is he says employers will discriminate based on people's qualifications. I will discriminate against you if you are not as qualified as the other candidate, or if you don't have the same skills, or if you don't have the same work habits, or you don't have the same behavior patterns, social abilities, whatever it is. So there is a basic form of discrimination that it is in an employer's best interest to make in order to better get the best employee for the job. And so that is a form of discrimination, but it's not one that we should tell people they can't do. And he uses the example of Mohawk Indians being excellent at climbing, not afraid of heights, and they could build the steel frames for the skyscrapers in the early 1900s, or the fact that Chinese laborers proved to be more efficient and skillful at doing certain jobs in Indonesia, or even I would say in California, building the railroads and other industries. So to discriminate, say, yeah, I want Mohawk Indians, or yeah, I want Chinese laborers, or yes, I want this certain group because generally they have better qualifications, skills, habits, and behavior patterns. That is a good type of discrimination. And he would argue in a free market, the second one is what's more prevalent, that in a free market where everyone is trying to get to be in competition with one another, then you're going to find no one's going, and we're going to go over this in another question, no one's going to discriminate and hold people to double standards, because we'll see that doesn't make any sense. That's going to cost your business productivity and money. So you will discriminate the second way, looking for people with the best skills, qualifications, habits, and behavior patterns. Okay, so question number 2, what mistake is made in identifying income differences among groups? Because a lot of times you'll get studies where they'll show that, women make less money than men, or minorities or blacks in particular make less money than other groups. And then they'll say this is an example of job discrimination. And he says they make the mistake. That's a mistake. That data is oftentimes flawed for a couple reasons. And you watched a video on this last week a little bit in terms of the gender pay gap. But the big problem with that is it lumps everyone into groups rather than looking at them in individuals. So that if you If you looked at, like, use the example again of just the Mohawk Indians, if you looked at the percentage of the number of people working on skyscrapers, and you saw that a large proportion of them were these Mohawk Indians, you would think, wow, they're discriminating against whoever's not getting the jobs. Why are they favoring this one group? They must be racist, you know. And again, I know they're racist towards the Native Americans, which a lot of people would say would be okay. But they're using job discrimination because they're looking at just the broad group, not realizing, well, that's because that group generally has certain qualifications, skills, habits, and behavior patterns that make it a more attractive employee. And they're not specifically going after them just because of their race or because of their gender, but because as individuals, they offer something that the company wants, and then that shows up as a larger difference across the whole. And so when you see issues with differences in male female pay, or even ethnic pay among different ethnicities, if you just look at the groups, you think there's some sort of systemic racism or discrimination going on, when really it's just arising from differences in individuals. And so what he says is the mistake is they should look more at, it ignores the specific qualifications, that if you want to see is there really, if you look at the individuals, then you'll actually compare the actual qualifications, skills, and habits, and behavior patterns. That when you actually, he says, like using an example of women, when you look at women with the same education and the same time in the market and the same qualifications as their men, they actually, and you compare them to the men of the same qualifications and that sort of thing, then their pay is the same. In fact, women tended to be paid more, showing that women with those qualifications were actually more valuable than men with those qualifications. Whereas you wouldn't see that if you just lump all women together, or lump all men together, or lump all blacks, or whatever, some large group together. But if you actually compare apples to apples, people with the same, again, qualifications, skills, habits, and behavior patterns, you know, employment history, educational level, occupational choices, things like that, you actually see that there isn't a difference in pay. It's the same. And so if you have, it's kind of like having too broad of a view. If you stand back too far, you see these differences and you associate those differences in pay to, again, some sort of discrimination. When if you zoom in, you realize, oh no, that's just because that group, for whatever reason, has different qualifications, skills, habits, and behavior patterns. And that as a whole is resulting in a difference in income. Okay, so question number 3 kind of builds off this. So what typically accounts for income differences among individuals, regardless of gender and ethnicity? And so again, if you actually look at the individuals and you actually say, okay, again, I'm not going to compare an apple to an orange. I'm not going to compare somebody who's been working for 2 years to somebody who's been working for 30 years. I'm not going to compare somebody just out of high school to somebody who has a master's degree. I'm not going to compare somebody who, again, is it going into engineering versus is going into, you know, being a kindergarten teacher, because all of those things are going to produce different income levels. And if you don't take those individual factors into account, again, the differences seem like some kind of discrimination, when really it's the result of something else. And he basically, some 4 key things: occupational choices, educational choices, continuous employment, and hazard pay. So if you don't factor in who's going into making those choices, you might make a mistake in terms of what you see as job discrimination. And this was a lot in the video that you watched on the gender pay gap, but it applies to any of these different groups. That it depends what jobs people are going into, and men and women tend to be drawn oftentimes towards different types of jobs. Men really don't mind working and being alone with technology, and being alone with working isolated and not in, you know, collaborative environments. Generally, women are more likely to choose professions and occupations that give them that collaboration, give them that more social interaction, and that result, those jobs pay differently. And so you're going to see a difference in income because different groups are drawn towards, for various reasons, to different occupational choices. Same thing with educational choices. For some people in groups, different educational choices make the most sense, and they're willing to go to school for 9 years. Others not, just the 4 years, or others just out of high school, and that's going to result in pay differences because they've made a different educational choice. The biggest one for women in making the difference is the continuous employment. That again, a lot of women, you know, they stop to have families, and that factors into how long they've been in the marketplace, their accumulation of skills and experience, the building of a resume, and so that's going to affect the types of jobs that they hold. And so then that too will reflect the income differences. And obviously that is, um, that is a kind of a biological bias, because that's just the fact of our human race of what women do and men don't. But to say that that is to an open, conscious discrimination ignores the fact that no, there's a biological reality here that is determining these different choices among individuals, and that's resulting in the pay gap, and it's not really a form of discrimination. And another one is hazard, is that hazardous jobs with higher death rates men tend to go into those jobs and not women. Again, kind of under occupational choices, and so those dangerous jobs pay more. And so it's not like women are being prohibited from going to those jobs, but there's a free choice. We live in a free country. People, make their personal selections, and more men go into the hazardous jobs, and so that reflects as a higher source of income. And again, if you just zoom out and look at that broadly, you see this what seems to be a huge form of discrimination, when in reality it's just the result of all these individual smaller choices. Again, specifically occupational choices, educational choices, continuous employment, and hazard pay. Another one is even the willingness to work overtime and be on call all the time. Okay, and the last one, number 4, why does it not make sense for employers to hire based on qualifications? In what type of firms, uh, uh, thus, is true discrimination likely to occur? And here he makes the point that discrimination, the first type, I'm going to hold different groups, men, women, ethnicities, whatever, to different standards. Doesn't make sense in a free market. In a free market, you want the best employee, and you're not going to just pass on and say, I don't want that qualified employee just because it's a woman, or just because they're Hispanic or whatever, because discrimination hurts an employer in a free market. It leaves a job open. The longer a job is left open, the longer that hurts and costs that employer money and productivity. And so to sit there and say a qualified person came in the door, but you didn't like, their country of origin, so you're not going to hire them. That he says that might happen, but over time in a free market, people aren't going to do that, because the people who act that way will be out competed. They'll go out of business. And so they'll be removed from the free market system, because you're going to want to fill that job immediately. You're going to want to get the person with the maximum skills. You don't care what they look like. You don't care where they come from. You don't care about their gender. And so it makes no sense to discriminate based on double standards. You're not going to leave that job open again to cost you more money, and you're not going to pass that skillful employee onto your competitor. You don't hire them because you don't like something, and then they go and work for somebody else, and that benefits somebody you're trying to outcompete. So it just makes no sense for employers to act this way. And even though some might, and some might could, they're not going to last long if they do that. Again, he uses the idea of I was looking at my notes here, artificially high. He says basically that if you discriminate, or discrimination only occurs, he says, in what types of firms thus is true discrimination likely to occur? It's most likely to occur where wages are kept artificially high. So in other words, if you have minimum wage laws, or you have labor unions negotiating, set wages that are above what they're artificially high, then you have a labor surplus. In both those situations, again, we talked about a price floor, minimum wage, you're going to have a labor surplus. And then if you have a surplus of labor, then employers are more likely to be able to discriminate. They can afford to discriminate if they've got lots of people lined up their door, and they can sit there and pick and choose, because then they're still able to fill their position, and they're not worried about losing those qualified people to their competitors. And again, this tends not to happen in the free market, at least not for very long. So the place where artificially high wages tend to exist are in government jobs. He says you actually find the longest and most entrenched form of jobs discrimination in government jobs, because those are not jobs governed by or regulated by competition or the free market. There's no consequence to those industries making poor choices and incurring higher costs, and lowering their productivity, because again, they're not spending their own money, and they're not faced with the same competitive forces. If you're in a government job and you're the post office, or you're the DMV, or you're the whatever, you're not dealing with the same market pressures that private firms are. And so it's actually government firms or monopolistic firms that can afford this type of discrimination. So in a free market, competitive market, you're not going to, again, employers can't afford job discrimination, not in terms of the first kind, where you're just holding people to double standards, but in a place where wages are set artificially high and where you're not regulated by market forces, which basically over the long term can only last in government uh, government uh, businesses. That's where you're actually going to find job discrimination the highest. And that's why it was interesting that, the point that he said in the early 1900s, there were black actors on Broadway, which is a private business, long before the military ever integrated. Because again, the private industry gets it first because they know where the money is. They have to compete to survive. They're fighting for survival, and they're going to do what makes economic sense first. The government always lags behind because they don't, and basically don't live in the real world. And so you actually have the discrimination lasting the longest in a lot of these government positions because, again, they're not held to the same free market forces that the private ones are. Okay, sorry, stumbled there a little bit on that last question, but good luck. And again, always reach out if you have any questions or need any clarifications.